The snow had been coming down since morning, the heavy, wet kind that coats the cedar hedges along the fence and makes the backyard look like something on a Christmas card, the kind my wife used to love. 3 years gone, and I still caught myself turning to point it out to her. I was standing at the living room window with a mug of tea going cold in my hand when my son's car pulled into the driveway. He came through the front door without stomping his boots the way I'd asked a dozen times, salt water spread in slow arcs across the hardwood. I'd spent most of a Saturday the previous April sanding and refinishing those floors, while he was at a conference in Calgary. He didn't know I'd done it. He assumed it was the neighbor's kid who did odd jobs on the street. I'd never corrected him. "You're home early," I said. "Yeah." He hung up his coat and called to my daughter-in-law in the kitchen. She appeared in the doorway wiping her hands on a tea towel, and something passed between them. One of those glances that takes less than a second but carries a full paragraph of information. I'd spent 37 years reading structural stress points for a living. I know a load-bearing moment when I see one. "Dad," my son said, "can we sit down?" I sat. He sat across from me. My daughter-in-law pulled a chair from the dining table and positioned it slightly behind him, the way people do when they've rehearsed something together and arrived at a shared position. They were expecting 11 weeks. The baby was due in late June. I felt real warmth move through me before anything else. Genuine, uncomplicated joy. My wife would have cried immediately. I nearly did myself. But my son kept talking. He explained carefully, and with what I could tell was rehearsed reasonableness, that they'd been thinking about the space situation. The guest room, my room, though I'd stopped calling it that, was the only logical option for a nursery. They'd need it set up by late March at the latest. They wanted to give me as much notice as possible. My daughter-in-law's mother knew someone on the management committee at a place called Riverside Gardens in Burlington. An independent living community. Apparently there was a waiting list, but they'd managed to have my name moved up. "It's not a care home, Dad," my son said quickly. "It's completely independent. Your own suite. Communal dining if you want it. The website looks really good." I looked at my daughter-in-law. She was watching me with the careful expression of someone who has pre-approved what her face is allowed to do. "How much notice do I have?" I asked. "End of January, if that works." 6 weeks. I nodded slowly, thanked them, said congratulations. I meant that last part entirely. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room and looked at the wall for a while. On the shelf beside the window there was a framed photograph, my wife and me at the opening of the Champlain Crossing ceremony in 2006, the year that project finished. She was laughing at something off. I was looking at her instead of at the bridge. I'd always liked that photo for that reason. The pattern had been established slowly, the way most damage is. After my wife died, my son had taken over what he called helping me manage things. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with printouts from financial websites and explained the difference between growth funds and income funds. He reviewed my utility bills and suggested I call to negotiate the rate. He set up automated payments for services I'd been paying automatically for 15 years. He explained RRSP contribution limits to me. I let him. Because in those first months after the funeral, he was barely functioning, and this, managing his father's modest affairs, gave him the scaffold to stand on. I understood that. I had designed scaffolding for a living. You put it up when the structure needs support. You take it down when the structure can bear its own weight. I had forgotten to take it down. Or perhaps I had simply lost track of whose weight I was actually carrying. My daughter-in-law's mother arrived the following afternoon with a folder. She was a compact woman with silver hair and the decisive manner of someone who has spent her life getting things organized to her own satisfaction. She'd never much warmed to me. I think I puzzled her. a retired engineer in a 12-year-old Volvo who seemed to have no opinions about renovation trends or HELOC rates, which were the two currencies of conversation in her circle. She spread the Riverside Gardens brochures across the kitchen table, while my daughter-in-law made tea. "The one-bedroom suites are a really good size for the price point," she said, turning a photo toward me. "And the dining room has a view of the escarpment, much nicer than I expected." The price point was $2,100 a month for a basic suite with cafeteria meals 3 times a week, woodworking club on Thursdays, movie nights twice monthly. "I understand you've been managing on your pension," she said. She said it with great gentleness, which somehow made it worse than if she'd been dismissive. "Riverside is very affordable for what you're getting, and at your stage, having meals provided is a genuine gift. You don't have to worry about any of it." "That's very kind," I said. She pushed the folder toward me. "I've already spoken with the director. She's holding a suite on the 2nd floor. It would just be a matter of confirming by Friday." My daughter-in-law walked her mother to the door. When she came back to the kitchen, she looked uncomfortable in the way that people do when they know something wasn't quite right, but can't name what it was. "You don't have to take the Riverside place," she said quietly, "if you have other ideas." "What other ideas would I have?" I asked, not bitterly, honestly. She didn't answer. I thanked her for the tea and went upstairs. "Before I tell you what I did next, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had someone make an assumption about you so completely, so confidently, that you almost started believing it yourself? Where you'd nod and let it pass and think, well, maybe. Maybe this is who I am now." If that's familiar, I'd like you to drop a comment below. I read all of them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd ask you to do that now, because what comes next is the part of this story I've kept close for 2 years, and I'm only just ready to tell it. That night, after the house had gone quiet, I sat on the edge of the bed with my laptop open on my knees. I hadn't shown anyone this screen in years. The registered retirement account, $1,940,000. The TFSA, $287,000. The pension income, $4,410 a month. The patent royalty account, which received quarterly deposits averaging $31,000 from licensing agreements with infrastructure firms in Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia. 2 commercial properties in Hamilton, a strip plaza on Upper James Street, and a warehouse unit near the airport, generating just under $6,400 a month combined. I had built this over 40 years. Some of it came from salary in the years when I ran my own engineering firm. Most of it came from the licensing of a bridge monitoring system my partner Henri Beaumont and I had developed in the mid-90s, a system using embedded sensors and real-time telemetry to detect before it became structural failure. We'd thought it was useful. It turned out to be considerably more than useful. As aging infrastructure became a national emergency, as governments started counting their bridges and finding the numbers alarming, what Henri and I had quietly built in a Hamilton office 25 years ago became something people were willing to pay a great deal to use. My wife had known all of it, every account, every property, every quarterly statement. We'd discussed telling Russ many times. She always said we'd know the moment when it arrived. She was diagnosed in September, gone by January. The moment hadn't come, and after, I was too busy holding the household together and letting my son believe he was holding me together to find it. Here is what I understood, sitting there in the dark with those numbers on the screen. The gift I'd thought I was giving my son had, over 3 years, quietly become a cage I'd built around both of us. I was 63 years old. I had appeared before parliamentary committees on infrastructure standards. I had overseen the construction of 7 major bridges across this country. I held 4 patents. I had a shelf of industry awards in a box in the closet I'd never gotten around to unpacking. and I had been nodding while my son explained RRSP basics to me. I closed the laptop and called Henri Beaumont. He answered on the second ring, which, for Henri, was practically leisurely. "Martin Calloway," he said, "I was beginning to think you'd become a hermit." "Not quite. What's the status on the federal bid?" I heard him pull in a breath. "Approved. Phase 1 confirmed. 6.2 million. Infrastructure Canada wants the bridge-safe architecture as the national standard, and they won't proceed without licensing your patents directly. Martin, I need you back as senior partner, not consulting, not advising. Your name on the door, 50%, same as always." I looked at the ceiling of the guest room. The ceiling I'd replastered 2 winters ago, after a slow leak from the bathroom above, without mentioning it to my son, because I hadn't wanted to worry him. "Give me a few days," I said. I spent the next 2 days looking at listings in a residential tower on King Street in Hamilton. The 28th floor, corner unit, floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 exposures. 1,200 square feet, a study, a proper kitchen. The view, the escarpment to the south, the harbor, the whole unsentimental working city spread out in winter light. The viewing was on a Wednesday. I paid 6 months' rent in advance by certified check. The property manager shook my hand and said she'd have the unit ready by the 1st of January. I drove back to my son's house and began packing my boxes. He helped me load them into my car on a Saturday morning. He carried the heavier ones without being asked, which I appreciated. My daughter-in-law filled a thermos of coffee for the drive and pressed it into my hands at the door. They stood on the porch and waved. My son assumed I was heading to Burlington. I turned left out of the subdivision instead of right, and I drove to Hamilton, and I did not lie to him. I told him everything was sorted and I'd send my new address. Which I did when he asked. The moment he looked it up was the moment everything changed. He told me the whole of it himself, later, in a coffee shop, his hands around a cup he'd stopped drinking from. He tried to forward a piece of mail to Riverside Gardens, and the envelope came back. He called the facility. They had no file on me, no application, nothing. He sat with that for a full day. Then he looked up my address. Then, because he is his mother's son as much as mine, thorough and precise when something doesn't add up, he started searching. He found the LinkedIn profile that Henri's assistant had been maintaining on my behalf for years. 37 years in structural engineering, co-inventor on 4 registered patents, founding partner. He found the Infrastructure Canada press release from that January, announcing the Bridge Safe national contract, which mentioned my name 4 times. He found the land registry records for both commercial properties in Hamilton. He called my wife's older sister in Kelowna. She listened to the shake in his voice and then said quietly that she wasn't surprised, that she'd always known, that his mother had spoken of it, had said more than once that Reese would understand eventually, that they just needed to wait for the right moment. "Your mother used to say your father was the steadiest person she'd ever known," his aunt told him. "She said he could carry more weight than anyone ever gave him credit for." Noelle found him at the kitchen table the next morning, still in his work clothes from the day before, surrounded by printed pages. She told me later that she'd never seen him look like that. Not even at the funeral. "I've been explaining registered accounts to him," he said, "for 3 years. To a man who managed more money than I'll earn in my entire career." She didn't know what to say. She told me she sat down beside him and put her hand on his arm, and they stayed like that for a long time without speaking. We met 12 days after I moved out. He suggested a cafe near my building. He was already there when I arrived, early, which was unusual, sitting with his hands wrapped around a cup he wasn't drinking from. He stood up when I came through the door. We sat across from each other. He didn't speak for close to a minute. "I found the press release," he said. "I thought you might, eventually." "Dad," he stopped, tried a different way in. "The federal contract, The patents, the buildings in Hamilton. He looked at the table. I didn't know any of it. I know. Why didn't you tell me? I took my time with that. I wanted to get it right. After your mother died, I said, you were barely keeping your head above water. You needed something to manage, something to be responsible for. I was close at hand, and I genuinely believed, at the time, that letting you feel useful was a thing I could give you. You were letting me patronize you. Yes. For 3 years. Yes. He pressed his thumb against the corner of his eye. That's not a gift, he said quietly. That's Dad. That's not what I needed. What did you need? He was quiet for a long moment. I needed you to be real, he said. I needed to know who you actually were, not who I'd decided you were. I nodded. That was well put, and I told him so. He reached into his jacket and set a small envelope on the table between us. My name on the outside in my wife's handwriting, the letters unhurried, and even the way she always wrote. He'd found it in a box of her things while sorting the hall closet. Tucked inside was a second envelope addressed to him, with a note in her hand. Give this to your father when you're both ready. I opened it at the table. Martin, if you're reading this without me in the room, things didn't go the way we planned. Tell him. Tell him everything. Not to impress him, and not to prove a point, but because he deserves to know who his father is. He's been loving a version of you that you were never meant to be. I think he's ready. I think, if you're both willing to be honest, you'll surprise each other. I folded the letter and put it in my jacket pocket. Reese was watching my face. She said to tell you, I said. He nodded once. Then he looked out the window at the January street. I'm sorry, he said finally, for the woodworking club. Something came out of me that I hadn't planned, somewhere between a laugh and something else entirely. He looked startled. Then he started laughing too, and we sat there in that coffee shop on King Street until the people at the next table glanced over to see what had gotten into the two of us. We talked for 2 hours after that, about what came next, about what a different relationship between us might look like. One built on what was true instead of what was convenient. He asked real questions about my career, about the patents, about Henri, and the federal contract. I answered them plainly, without the performance of modesty I'd been wrapping around myself for years. I want to know you, he said near the end, the actual version. That's all I ever wanted, I said. I joined Henri as senior partner in February. My daughter-in-law's mother called me 3 weeks into the new year, without preamble, and said she owed me an apology. I told her she had made assumptions, which was true, and that I understood the impulse, which was also true. She asked if I would have coffee with her and my daughter-in-law sometime. She said she'd been doing some thinking. I said yes. My son came to the announcement dinner in March, shook Henri's hand, and asked him technical questions about the monitoring architecture for 20 minutes. Henri found me in the kitchen afterward and said, "Your son is a different man than I expected." "He's finding his way," I said. The baby arrived on a Thursday evening in late June. My son called me from the maternity ward at 11:30, and his voice had the quality of a man who had just had the floor go out from under him and discovered he was floating instead of falling. "He looks like Mum," he said. "They all say that the first night." "No," he said, "he really does." I drove to the hospital in the rain. He met me in the corridor in his surgical gown and walked me down to the room where my daughter-in-law was sleeping. And there was my grandson in a rolling bassinet under a warming light, very new and entirely serious about whatever he was already thinking. They'd named him Patrick, after my father. I had not asked for this, had not expected it, and when my son told me, I had to sit down in the plastic chair by the window and take a moment. "Mum said once that your dad was the person you most reminded her of," my son said. "She said it was the highest compliment she could think of." I held Patrick in the rocking chair while the city moved below, and the rain continued, and my daughter-in-law slept, and my son sat across the room with his eyes half open, too tired to sleep. The building was quiet, the way hospitals go quiet in the small hours, a particular kind of stillness that doesn't ask anything of you. I am 63 years old. I have designed bridges that will outlast everyone who was in that room. I have held patents and managed portfolios and sat before committees and done all of it steadily and without much fanfare, which I had always considered a kind of professional integrity. But sitting there with my grandson in my arms, I thought about the cost of steadiness that tips into silence, about the specific unreturnable years spent performing a kind of helplessness because I believed it was what someone I loved needed to see. About my wife's letter, which I would read again every few days for months afterward, each time understanding something slightly different in it. Love is not a performance. It is not something you arrange for another person's comfort and then maintain indefinitely because the arrangement has become familiar. It is what remains when you stop managing the impression you're making and allow yourself to be seen in full, capable and flawed and present, without apology. That took me a long time to learn, longer than it should have. Patrick made a small sound and settled, one fist against his cheek, his expression suggesting he had already assessed his surroundings and found them acceptable. Across the room, my son's breathing had finally evened out. My daughter-in-law would wake in an hour, and we would all begin the long, imperfect, necessary work of knowing each other honestly. I stayed until morning. I drove home as the city came awake around me, the escarpment catching the first light somewhere behind the clouds. The real version of things, I thought, turning onto King Street. It is always worth the wait.